Hi there, I'm Renos Vakis, lead economist at the World Bank, and your host for Accelerating Development Ideas for Impact. This is not your typical podcast. It's an AI powered conversation brought to you by the World Bank Institute for Economic Development, where we unpack the latest research with one goal in mind, turning big ideas into real world impact. Let's get started.
Thank you for the introduction, Reynos. This morning, you probably grabbed a coffee without thinking twice. You trusted it was safe to drink, that the machine worked, that the cup wouldn't fall apart in your hands. It's such a small moment, but behind it is a whole system quietly making sure everything meets a certain standard. And that same system scales all the way up to global trade. Welcome to our show. This is the third episode in the World Development Report 2025 Standards for Development series. In fact, we're doing a special 3-episode deep dive into the report, building on episode 20, The Power of Standards, Why a Metal Box, a Checklist, and a Plug Socket Can Change an Economy, which explored the big picture. In this mini-series, each episode zooms in on 2 to 3 chapters, unpacking the ideas in more detail, for those who want to go beyond the headlines and really understand how standards shape development in practice. This first episode of the mini-series looks at chapter 1, 2, and 3 in the report.
It's very exciting. On previous episodes of our show, we discussed standards as the invisible infrastructure of the global economy. But simply writing down new rules isn't enough to make that infrastructure function.
Right. The report highlights a stubborn problem called the vicious circle of low quality. Many low and middle-income countries find themselves trapped in this cycle. They face low market demand, weak institutional capacity, and incredibly high compliance costs.
The financial burden of proving compliance is the biggest roadblock. Small and medium enterprises in developing nations face costs that are almost impossible to absorb. Let's look at small manufacturers of surgical instruments in Pakistan.
I saw that example. To comply with the European Union medical device regulation, those firms face up to 200,000 euros in costs for the first year alone.
Exactly, 200,000 euros. And then they must pay another 30,000 euros in subsequent years. These are small firms, typically having only 20,000 to 300,000 euros in total annual sales.
That means the initial compliance cost could easily exceed their entire yearly revenue. A business simply can't survive those margins. We see a similar hurdle with voluntary sustainability standards in East Africa.
We do. For agricultural firms there, auditing expenses for voluntary standards, like global GAP, range from 2,000 to 15,000 US dollars per firm. This is where the cost transforms from a helpful quality check into a massive barrier to trade.
We all agree the cost barrier matters. But the real story here is how policymakers can fix this without abandoning quality. The report outlines a regulatory toolkit to balance a country's ambition with its actual capacity.
This is the turning point for policy. Governments frequently fall into a trap called isomorphic mimicry. They try to leapfrog their development by setting highly ambitious standards that look world-class on paper, due to external pressure or as a signal to others, without having the intention and capacity to enforce them.
So they essentially copy advanced rules, but lack the laboratories and inspectors to enforce them. That just creates an illusion of progress, while the reality on the ground stays the same.
Precisely. To avoid this, the report advises carefully choosing between voluntary and mandatory standards. Governments should use mandatory command and control standards only when uniform compliance is required or when preventing severe or irreversible damage.
Right. You need mandatory rules for specifying the minimum strength of construction materials to prevent a bridge from collapsing, or for ensuring public safety at a nuclear power plant.
Yes, exactly. But for driving technological innovation and market efficiency, voluntary standards are much better suited. They encourage businesses to upgrade without locking the entire economy into rigid, expensive requirements.
Here's the part that really surprised me. The report looks back at the 19th century to show how different policy paths shape risk management. It specifically compares responses to steam boiler explosions.
That's a brilliant historical contrast. France, in my work through to make from policy over the commit and expensive requirements, France can be feeling with amazing meet review of a political requirements. They also work with confused into policy. That chose a highly centralized, government-mandated approach. They focused on strict structural design standards and required annual state inspections for all boilers.
Most people assume that heavy government oversight would automatically be the safest route, but the data shows a very different outcome in Great Britain.
It really does. Great Britain rejected mandatory government standards. Instead, they relied on private insurance companies to inspect boilers and set maintenance rules based on premium costs.
And the private market-driven approach worked remarkably well. The explosion rate for insured British boilers dropped to just 2 per 10,000 annually. They ended up being significantly safer than the French boilers of the same era.
That history lesson leads perfectly into the next major solution area. Countries need a structured, sequential path to build their quality infrastructure, often called QI.
This ecosystem includes standardization, metrology, accreditation, and conformity assessment. A previous episode mentioned adapt, align, author for adopting standards. Now we're looking at basics, broaden, balance for enforcing them.
Exactly. Basics is the first step. Low-income countries should establish fundamental foundations using public institutions. They must focus public quality assurance, like testing and inspection, primarily on high-stakes areas like public safety and exports.
So you build the core public plumbing first. Then, as the economy matures, you move to broaden and balance.
Yes, as economies grow, governments must transition conformity assessment tasks over to the private sector. The state shifts from being a direct service provider to acting more like a referee.
In practice, that means the state relies on independent accreditation and market surveillance to oversee private auditors. But here's the tricky part policymakers face right now: institutional conflicts of interest.
This is a massive friction point. Severe resource constraints often force developing nations to combine multiple QI functions into a single government entity.
So the exact same body that develops the standard also earns money by certifying that companies comply with it. That dynamic clearly compromises the integrity of the whole system.
It completely undermines trust, and the scope of the problem is striking. 95% of national standards bodies in low-income countries offer these conformity assessment services. For lower middle-income countries, the figure sits at 80%.
Wow. And the report notes that in lower middle-income countries, the national standards bodies rely on conformity assessment services for nearly 40% of their total revenues.
Which means they literally can't afford to separate the roles. They need the income. However, there's a very practical, cost-effective way forward. Overcoming these scale constraints requires regional cooperation.
Ah, that connects the dots for me. Not every country needs or can afford to build a fully independent ecosystem from scratch. They can share the burden.
Regional resource sharing is highly effective. The Southern African Development Community provides a perfect model. They established the world's first regional multi-economy accreditation body, known as SADACUS.
I read the details on SADACUS. It operates efficiently with only 21 full-time staff, but it leverages a network of nearly 100 regional experts.
And by pooling those experts, they successfully serve 14 member states. Previously, those individual nations simply couldn't afford to maintain their own national accreditation bodies. Now, they share a credible, functioning system.
That's a brilliant solution for smaller economies. It proves that progress isn't about a country doing everything alone. It's about building smart, shared frameworks.
That's the ultimate takeaway for policymakers. Escaping the vicious circle of low quality requires more than just drafting ambitious targets. It requires building reliable, accessible pathways for local businesses to actually meet those goals. When governments transition from overwhelmed service providers to smart referees, they build the trust needed to make standards work for everyone. Over to you, Rinos.
Thank you for joining us. You can find the full report on our website, Just follow the link in the description. Be sure to subscribe to be the first to know about upcoming episodes. And before you go, how do you plan to put what you learn into practice? And what topics you'd like us to explore next? We'd love to know. Until then, goodbye.